I realized that when I create, I'm becoming more like my creator. And that relationship, I was like, oh, I am made in the image and likeness of God.
Welcome to Raising Grace. I'm Sister John Dominic.
And I'm Dr. Karen Villa.
We're so happy today to have with us
Sari Vasquez.
Right. So we go back, we've been working together now, it's 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, it's gotta be a long time.
And really we've had this collaboration that all three of us have been working together with a larger team when we put together what we call a Virtue Strength Survey, which we will talk about during the show. But before we go into that, I'd love for you to share with our audience your background and really how we kind of came together.
How I got here?
I know, exactly.
Sitting next to Dr. Villa, So as I mentioned earlier on some of our earlier shows, my background's in education, so I've been an educator for, almost 15 years. And so I taught in schools, and then I did a lot of work with college students, and that really brought me to wondering what really helps students to thrive. What I was noticing in college was that some students were really thriving and staying resilient with challenge, and others were, in the face of challenge, really finding it challenging. And so I ended up going back and getting my degree in positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. And it was their sister that circuitously, I'm here, surprisingly enough, right? I went to K-12 Catholic school. I'm a practicing Catholic, and I got to this, I was sitting there in 2019 during my degree program, and positive psychology, the science of positive psychology is around really this understanding of human strengths, right? So the field's been around, pretty new, about 20 years or so. And it really was meant to, complement traditional psychology. Traditional psychology has been really focused on, the disease and treatment model, right? Like diagnosing mental disorder and helping individuals to find peace and calm in the midst of mental illness. But what was really happening, the field was missing this whole part of, it's one thing to fix, mental illness, but what happens and how do we help human beings to thrive and flourish? And these two things really balance each other out. So when I was sitting in my positive psychology courses at the University of Pennsylvania, I was, starting to realize that there was this deep connection between the things that I had been learning in my K-12 Catholic education and the things that I was learning about mental health and emotional health. And I was like, wait, virtue? This is the stuff that I learned in kindergarten. It's wild that those things connect and really have a lot of benefits that we maybe we overlook or we don't know about,
Right. So you started in education. So you got your first degree was from
Harvard,
Harvard, you got your master's
in education.
Was there any specific part of education or just?
Yeah, specifically I was studying higher education because at the time I was supporting college students. So
nice.
I really wanted to know what happens afterwards, what happens in college, and how does that environment look for students to navigate through.
Right. Because one of the things that Dr. Phil and I have been talking about and sharing actually with our audience is we're talking about virtue education, but we also say that virtue is social emotional learning.
It is,
Very much
exactly,
so. And we'll be able to share about that.
It wires the brain for health and flourishing,
absolutely,
and well-being.
Yeah. Which is surprising to me. I mean, I guess because as a kid, I never thought about those things. But when you look at the research, it's pretty substantial on the connections,
right?
And clear, very clear.
Yeah. So I kind of feel like you two could really start taking off right now in this conversation.
Sari worked with Martin Seligman, who is just an incredible thought leader in our field. So I wonder what it was like to be under his mentorship. That was so cool.
It's very interesting because I think in a lot of ways that field, so you're right, Marty Seligman, really brought together researchers that have been doing this for a while, but just in different arenas under this total field that looks at this movement from I guess the 0 point to thriving, right? It's how do we help people to not just bounce back, but bounce forward.
There you go.
So it was the the things that we were learning about, I think in a lot of ways were just these like deep human truths that gratitude, right? Kind acts, things that like, we might be like, oh yeah, we know that those are important, but research is finding why they're so important for the brain, for our mental, emotional health.
Yeah, and as a cradle Catholic, you know that virtue is such a treasure in our Catholic faith, and then you are in this powerhouse scientific educational setting, and that's what it all is. It's virtue, right?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, and Sister, you and I have talked about this before. Like, I was a cradle Catholic, and I am a cradle Catholic, and I felt like I had another, you're not going to call it a conversion back, but it was a deepening of something that has always been in my heart. But I was like, wow, there is so much to this when, Christ says like this is fulfillment. That is
exactly
true.
because we look to Christ and we talk about this. And I think what this does is a bit context around the idea that Christ, is the perfectly virtuous man, right?
Yes.
And what I'd love for you to tell the audience is that, I don't know if I should wait or kind of keep you hanging on this, but okay. Tell them the title of your capstone paper.
Oh yeah, so it's called The Happy Saint.
The Happy Saint. Yeah, the Happy Saint. Right?
And what's funny about it is that kept coming out in this program where I was learning about these things and I was like, there's something about sainthood. I mean, saints are morally virtuous. Human beings that obviously are, directed towards God. And that research is also substantial, religion, spirituality, and how important those things are for our health and well-being. And so I was like, there's something to sainthood. And so I wrote my paper called The Happy Saint. Our call to holiness is a call to happiness.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
Right.
I mean, and then coming through that. So what are a couple things on that you could share?
I mean, I think a big part of this is, and the thing that I think really drives me in the work is the recognition that we all have inherent goodness, right? Like we are made in the image and likeness of our divine creator. And I think, and Dr. Fuller, you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, I think sometimes we forget that, right? Like we are so focused on, how the world sees us and our deficit-based lens, and we're ready to say these are my flaws instead of remembering that we also have this inherent goodness. And so when I was going through my program at Penn, one of the big foundations of positive psychology is built on human strengths. We have strengths, you have strengths, I have strengths, Dr. Villa has strengths, and when we operate and live into those, we do live happier lives. We are building more positive relationships. We are deeply engaged in the work that we do. We find meaning and purpose. But
our default is this negativity bias, right?
Yes, exactly.
So we have to put effort into
to override that.
To lift that up into something that's more good and positive.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then when you talk about virtue too, it's just this habit, this disposition towards goodness, but it's actually what even the Catechism says that it's, we bring the best of ourselves. And sometimes we forget that line in there.
Yeah.
And I think this is one thing that we've all shared about, sometimes if we find out what our virtue strengths are, which the survey does, right?
Yes.
Okay. That it's okay to talk about that. And we were, obviously you will know that one of hers is studiousness because we're here, she's telling us about her third degree.
Learning.
I'm with you on that.
I was just saying, Dr. Bill is the same way.
And I was like, we are like souls.
We're with these people that have this love for learning, right?
Yes,
and bringing people together. I like to be a connector on these things, So with the because this is really, so the Virtue Strength Survey that it's almost completely a validated test.
That is a lot of thought and work went into that.
And we've had well over 3,000 high school students that have taken it.
Phenomenal.
We have teachers that are taking it. I can just watch, when people take it, it kind of changes the room when they're sharing this. But I think there's certain things that you have developed, because you were looking at the VIA Strength Survey, that's really how our conversation started, but about the idea of virtue spotting, and if you could share that concept and kind of where that all came from.
Yeah, and so I think like one of the like important things about knowing your strengths, and this is like, you know, Dr. Villa might have something to say about this too, is it's one thing to know our strengths, right? Like I understand that I have strengths, but when we see some benefits there, right? Like it builds our self-efficacy. We start to believe that we can do things. But like, it's not until we also act on those strengths. So it's not just the knowing, it's also applying those strengths that is very important. And to your point, Sister Dominic, you're talking about virtue spotlighting. It's also not just knowing my own strengths and acting on those, but it's also being able to strength spot in others, because there's this positivity resonance that happens between us when I'm like, you know, telling Dr. Villa, I'm so grateful for, you know, the things that you bring to this space because they are making an impact here. The science of mattering, I mean, one of the things that I always remembered from my program is, you know, the science of mattering is built on two things. I have value just for who I am. So I have these strengths, I have this inherent dignity. I'm made in the image and likeness of my creator. I have value and I add value. That's when we feel like we matter. Right, so when we're telling and sharing with people how they add value to this space for being who they are, that's when we start to see this.
Right, and that's that connectedness, that relational
positive relationships. It's so important in lifting the brain up to.
I was going to ask, what are the impacts on our brain in that with relationships?
Largely neurochemical, right? When we notice the good in each other, when we're working in harmony, we have more dopamine, we have more serotonin, and those are the feel-good chemicals in our brain. So it has a physical marker.
Yeah, it makes sense, right?
And obviously our creator knows all that, right? Creating his
he
created
it. Yeah, he designed it.
And one of the things that Dr. Villa and I have been doing as we've been having these same conversations is that we, especially with the understanding, like with the social emotional learning, and especially since her next degree is master's in spirituality. Okay,
it's like I had to go deep.
Right, but actually what's beautiful is that seeing the need in education has led to this understanding of positive psychology, which has led to the understanding of virtue, which is the happy saint, the ingredient for the happy saints. But the happy saints live in God's grace, right? Yes. So we able to live in relationship with God. We live in His grace, which is our very participation in His life. Yep. And the spirituality is what nurtures God's
it's the relationship
life within. You know, it's
And as a child, you didn't even realize how important that was.
And you guys, this is, and honestly, I think this is the moment that all started to be. I can remember this vividly. I was sitting at my desk at work, and I had, you know, when those like thoughts come to you and you're like, you just know it's the Holy Spirit. There was this thought that was like, so my number one strength, you know, at the time was, and still as creativity, it's a big strength that floats within me. And I realized that when I create, I'm becoming more like my creator. And that relationship, I was like, oh, I am made in the image and likeness of God. Like God is a creator. And so like that, it helps us to build that relationship. And that's why I'm going to study spirituality, which is the lived relationship, right? Like our lived and felt experience of that relationship with God.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah.
And so right on.
So with the Virtue Strength Survey, so we talked about the virtue spotlighting, and then there's the other idea of the sharing. This was the kind of the awkward thing, which is hard for us to do. But what's nice though is that we're able, like when I took it, my strengths were obedience. Well, I know and this is the one that cracks people up, but it's like modesty. Okay, obviously we look at this and they're like, well, that's easy, sister. But it's also in speech, you know, and how you don't really have to kind of like put yourself out there, and then sincerity.
Oh,
and I know. It's
like obedience is mine too. So I'm glad that
I know. And it isn't like we're like these rule followers, right? It's the ability to listen,
absolutely,
and respond to what it is. And I think that was the Blessed Mother's high one too.
Yeah.
So
I wouldn't doubt it.
Yes,
I mean, and
wouldn't doubt it.
I think that the obedience one, at the beginning, I was like, obedience, really? I'm just a rule follower. But then I realized it's so much more than that, right?
Yeah.
It's understanding where my heart is being called, where like my vocation lies, how God is calling me in these moments,
and listening to
that, right? It's like deeply listening. Yeah.
So when you share that with other people and then you give the feedback, so I know that was something that you've talked about doing with young people.
Yes.
And so I don't know if you could share with our audience, what you've done and how you go about that process and the change you've seen.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
So the first and foremost, you take the virtue survey to understand, okay, so, through this survey, what are my top strengths? And everybody has top strengths, right? And our strengths it's like this unique constellation, right? Even though you and I have obedience, that can be lived out different ways in both of us. And so the next piece to this is like a deeper exploration, right? So you build awareness, and then it's a deeper exploration of self. Like, where in my life do these strengths show up, right? Like, am I, practicing these at work, at school, at home, in my relationships, in various different domains in my life. You sort of do that deep exploration. When do I use my strengths? When I'm stressed and anxious, in challenging times, right?
Yeah, because we're more likely to use our weaknesses.
Exactly.
Stress, right?
And remembering that, like, actually those things are resourcing for those moments of challenge. And
like
then
an anchor.
Like an anchor. Yeah, that's a great
right?
that is a really great metaphor, because they, the boat can, unanchored, can just drift, right? So you do some of this deeper exploration, and then I lead students and others through planning out how we're going to apply our strengths, right? We know from behavioral science, we're more likely to follow through on actions when we actually plan them out, and the research shows that just by practicing one of our tried and true strengths, top strengths, in a new way over 1 week, they found results that had lower depressive symptoms 6 months later, higher positive affect, and that's just like us living into who we are, right? I'm practicing those in new ways. So maybe with my studiousness strength, I might go practice learning in a new domain, right? I might say, oh, this is something I've been curious about lately, so I'm going to go read an additional book about this thing. That might be a new way to practice the strength.
Right, so there's the action that we need to do, because we just can't kind of sit around and think, okay, I don't have anything or whatever. It's like, let's find out.
Right.
And as I tell people, there's no way you can fail a virtue test.
No, there's
right?
no,
right? So even if you
will not fail it.
Right, because if it's low, then you find ways to cultivate it, you educate it, you find, and you have to develop those practices to be able to increase whatever it may be. If it's something like affability. Sometimes that tends to be a little bit lower for me, and I get insulted, and I was like, no, wait a second. Wait a second, you just have to realize I'm probably more of an introvert, and it's just being more conscious of smiling or whatever it may be, but I have to intentionally, practice that and find ways to go out of my way.
It is the practicing that does the wiring.
Exactly, exactly.
Which is the neuroplasticity,
yes,
right?
That's what wires it
So you're seeing all these words that you've been hearing all along, we're putting them into action right now, right?
And it's always interesting about justice is the fourth cardinal virtue and empathy, that it's not just recognizing what's needed in the world, it's taking action to do it. And it's that continual action and practice that does.
Yeah, and that's the cool thing is we can practice these. It's not like I just have it or I don't. Like humility, I have it or I don't. No, we can practice these things even if they are lower. And I have a good friend that talks about this concept of strengths lassoing, where it's you can lasso your top strengths for some of these ones that are a little bit lower that you're oh, well, I really want to build my affability. How do I lasso what I already have? To plan to practice that more diligently.
Right.
So we typically do some of the work on action, planning, and then to your point, sister, it's not just enough for us to do the self work, right? It's also understanding who everybody else is and being able to virtue spot in others. And so one of the ways that we do this is we write stories. We write stories about times when we were at our best, and we share those stories. And this might be the vulnerability
That's the
part.
part.
It's
yeah,
hard.
Ooh, I got to read that in front of everybody. But what's really beautiful is that once you do it, and then what we do in this exercise is you have everybody in the group.
Yep.
Give feedback and say, yes, I see that in you. And you can just almost see the expression in people's faces where, I don't know, it's just this building up.
So uplifting, right?
Right, exactly. And it's that, and I think even when we talk about co-regulation, it's the nervous system kind of calms, and
it can also uplift.
Right, and you're put into that, there's that harmony that happens, and you're seeing yourself
exactly
in a new light.
Yeah, and I mean, and that is the lived practice of seeing the image in God, like of God in others, right? It's like when and I think we've been told that as kids, right? Like, just like see Christ in that person, Sari. And it's like, that is very hard. But if I remember, like, wait a minute, if you took that virtue survey, what would come up as your top strengths? And how am I seeing like the very essence of Christ within you?
Right.
So important in relationship.
And I think the thing is like, again, we're going back to the spirituality and just how this has been, like, for yourself, just a journey, Oh,
yeah.
And that we always know that, that this is how God has designed us to be, this created image and likeness, that his grace is what, he's the one that gives the growth. But the beautiful thing is that we have the free will. We have the intellect and the free will, which are, these are our faculties of our soul, right? And so what we're doing is that when we're making these plans, we're living it, is that we're responding to his grace, and it's increasing, and that he wants us to really, this means to human flourishing.
Yes, yes.
And to really this happiness, becoming the person that God has created
designed
us to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that has such a place in education. I mean, we talk about it for adults, but our children really need this in this day and age.
Agreed.
This guidance towards happiness and flourishing and well-being, because there's so many forces at work that would carry them far afield from that.
Yeah, and it's amazing too that, like, this stuff has been a part of our tradition, a part of our faith for such a long time. And it's like, wait, that stuff is applicable to our mental health needs today. Like, yes.
It's incredible treasure.
Yes,
and
incredible.
We should really
and that's
bring
one
it
thing
back
we continue to share. I mean, like, this has been a part of our faith for centuries. And even back to Aristotle and the time of the early philosophers. And well, so anything else in the capstone paper that you could share?
Yeah, I think some of the interesting, and I mean, this, maybe Dr. Vela has some things to say about this too, but I think some of the interesting research that's happening right now with virtue is its connection to, like, overuse and underuse of strengths, of character, has been tied to and linked to, mental illness and disorder, right? So when I think about, like, having the right amount, the balanced, Aristotle talks about the golden mean, the balanced amount of the strength of, virtue, so important, right? Because if you have too much of the strength or too little, like, you're over practicing or under practicing. And
there's problems with that.
Problems, exactly. Like, and I think about, like, humility, right? Like, right amount of humility, great. Like, too much humility, self-deprecation, not great. And, like, not enough, narcissism. And, like, both of those two things are not ideal. And so really, like, the right practice of a strength of virtue. I don't know, maybe you have some more to say about that, Doctor.
Like living in the river of grace.
Yes. It is. As far as daily behavior, living in the river of grace, we can end up with too much or too little of something. But then character formation over time really is, integrating these extremes into something that's balanced and works well for us. Yes. So the balanced life is the happy life.
Is the happy life, exactly.
Integrated life, exactly.
Yeah, like, you don't want it, like, you don't want too much of the two, like, the both extremes. Like, you want to have just the right amount. Goldilocks, like that, the three bears, like, just right fit.
All right, so we talked about the Virtue Field Guide, which is here, which we've developed for people. And one of the things we did in here is for each of the virtues, there's like a plant or animal that's kind of just for fun. So why don't you take a peek and find out what it is for your time?
Yes.
For studiousness.
I was like studiousness or obedience. I'm curious about obedience.
Obedience, So
let's see, which page? Like, there's so many of them. All right, 112.
Let's see if what do you think about that? We're just doing this off the cuff here.
Okay, so
it's a walrus.
Yeah, it's a California sea lion.
Oh, I see.
This marine mammal is so trainable that the U.S. Navy, we just talked about that, the Navy, uses them to complete difficult operations such as catching unauthorized swimmers and locating underwater mines. Wow, I'm pretty important, guys.
I know.
I'm a California sea lion.
Roar like a sea lion, though, right?
Oh my God. I probably don't have those talents, sister. But it is interesting because I do think that obedience is something that, again, like kind of gets a bad rap. And it's like, oh, but you know, like the California sea lion. I mean, this is where you follow and you listen deeply.
Yes. So I think the thing is, like, one thing I love about this, and I'll be talking about this in different things. So we talk about grace, or we talk about living virtuously. You know, we're at this moment where we're becoming fully who God's created us to be, right? That moment of human flourishing. So just like the animals, you know, they, by instinct, whatever they have, there's certain sounds that different animals do, right?
Yep.
So if a sea lion is making the sound of a bird, it's like, it doesn't go together, right?
Right. To be where you were designed to be.
Right.
Exactly.
So I think that's why I just love the idea, again, this understanding of what it means to be a happy saint, you know?
Yeah.
And I don't know, I think, and again, the human flourishing, becoming God who's created us to be.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that is... You like, that is in a lot of ways what Aristotle was talking about with virtue, right? Like when we are like living into the best of who we are as human beings, like we are practicing the virtuous life. And we find like later on that is when we like are practicing the virtuous life, we are flourishing in many different domains. And so, yeah, I mean, I just think it's cool that science is finding what we like have known to be true for a long time, also true.
It's amazing.
Exactly. You said that so well. You know, I mean, it just kind of rolled off her tongue because it's true. You know, and that's what we've been discussing, and again, working with Race and Grace, and just trying to give, you know, parents and educators just a roadmap, you know, to help young people, because there's so much out there today that's pressing in against them, you know, pushing them towards this isolation, this disconnectedness.
And then there's so much information. This really distills it down to what's important and what has worked.
Yes. Yeah. Tried and true.
And so one last thing before we kind of wrap up, in the spirituality, what's one thing you've discovered in that and your
in my new program endeavor?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have found fascinating is St. John of the Cross's like pathway to the spiritual system that John of the Cross has set up, but really like a lot of spiritual, a lot of like the spiritualities, like the threefold path, are just like leading us to purity of heart, right? Because the pure heart it sees the face of God, right? So when we are clean of heart, and I think that is like, to tie this back to what we just talked about with virtue and understanding who I am, it is getting to that real and true self, not our false self that can cloud our like vision. Thomas Merton, like, I guess, you know, maybe famously said that he doesn't want to get to the end of his life and like he gets up to heaven and God says, I don't know you, because like the person that we show up as is not the person that we were designed to be. And so getting to that true self and understanding our the true God, that is the spiritual path.
That's right. That's beautiful. St. Catherine of Siena always talked about the self-knowledge is the beginning of self-knowledge.
Exactly.
And understanding your virtue strengths, understanding how we're wired together and created, and just bringing all this beautiful positive psychology and the neuropsychology together,
it's
and
so exciting.
The virtuous life together, all together. I kind of said together a lot there, didn't I?
Together.
That's right. So we encourage you, check out the Virtue Strength Survey, openlightmedia.com, the Virtue Field Guide, so you can find out what animal describes your virtue. And the next time you start your next degree, we'll bring you back.
Oh, yeah. No, Studios Nest, for sure.
Thanks
Sister.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for joining us for Season 1 of Race and Grace Made for Wholeness. We have a lot more content to cover, and I look forward to seeing you in Season 2.